He's a monotheist. So many scholars believe that Moses got monotheism from Akhenaten, right? Now, last night we suggested he got monotheism from who? His mom and dad, right? Do you see the difference? How that's playing out? And so there's a second reason. It says in the Bible that they built the cities of Ramses. And so I just asked you, anybody been to New Amsterdam recently? Anybody been? Has anybody ever been to New Amsterdam? None of you been to New York? Oh, you don't call it New Amsterdam, but that's what it was originally called, right? Because we wouldn't understand where you went. So at the time the Bible was being written, they're calling it the cities of Ramses. But originally it wasn't Ramses, it would be really Avaris, okay? And so we can't go by that, but they take these things and they then reject what the Bible clearly says, 1 Kings 6:1, 480 years, and they get into all of this other material. So again, we want to try and follow more of the biblical story, so that's why we have a different Pharaoh of the Exodus than you might find on Google. But this is going to be more of the where we want to go biblically. So that's a good question on Egypt, and I wanted to cover that because some people think Cecil must have been right or Disney must have been right with the king of Egypt. And so this is a typical king of Egypt and the king or the Pharaoh of the Exodus, but it would not be biblically. So maybe we have one more question before 7 o'clock comes and we get transformed into doing something different. Yes, ma'am. Large Palestinian camps in Jordan. Jordan really doesn't have a lot of the camps. Most of the camps, I shouldn't say that. They have camps. The larger camps nowadays are going to be Syrian camps, Iraqi camps. A bit more political, but I'll just say my hat is off to Jordan. I think Jordan is the finest country in that part of the world. They doubled their population in 1948, accepting Palestinian refugees from people who fled what became Israel. They doubled their population. They doubled their population again in 1967. They've taken in millions of Iraqi refugees from the war that we initiated. They've taken in millions of Syrian refugees, and somehow they've remained a stable kingdom. And so my hat is always off to Jordan and have lots of respect for them, and they typically honor Christians and the rights of individuals in Jordan. So, but we do find lots of camps in the West Bank, Palestinian camps, as well as in Lebanon and so on. So the West Bank, because of people that lived in what became Israel. So even in Jericho, there are lots and lots of refugee camps and so on, and in various places of the West Bank from people who fled what became Israel. Okay, any questions about Egypt? Maybe I'm going to escape what I got into in the other meeting there, Pastor Paul. You know, that might be good for me. You know, I should learn to quit while I'm ahead, probably. We had some questions in the other meeting about the route of the Exodus and where is Mount Sinai. Where is Mount Sinai, by the way? Saudi Arabia, somebody is saying. I hear that. The bottom of the Sinai. There's a lot of different ideas for Mount Sinai. And there's a popular idea lately that Mount Sinai is in Saudi Arabia, and they call it Jebel Law. And so a lot of people say it must be because they're calling it even Jebel Law. Just want to remind you that Muslims believe that Mount Moriah is also in Saudi Arabia. So be very careful what you pick up from Muslims, okay? Just because they call it Jebel Law doesn't mean a lot. So I'm not a believer in Saudi Arabia personally, but we do have a couple of different candidates for Mount Sinai in the Sinai. One is the Wadi Nusib. There's a place called Sarabit el-Qadim. That's where the Egyptians mined turquoise. The only reason they went into the Sinai was to mine turquoise, and only in the wintertime because it is a furnace. And they would go out there and they mine turquoise, and out in this place, William Shea, a good scholar friend of mine, I drove him out so we could go out and photograph what's called the Proto-Sinaitic writings, these precursors of the Canaanite language and Hebrew and all of this. And they had these early writings, really the first writings, transition between hieroglyphs and the later languages of the Canaanites, and later after that the Hebrews. And so we went out to that, maybe one tree in the whole valley. I mean, and I'm talking about the valley is the good part because it's all sand before that. But here they have these early things, and Dr. Shea was feeling maybe this was the area of where the Israelites had been, and he was seeing some things that other people didn't see, and that's why we had to photograph that. And so the Wadi Nusib. What's interesting about the Wadi Nusib is the Egyptians, they had their turquoise mines there, and they built over 1,500 years. They developed a temple to Hathor. So the patron goddess of the Sinai is Hathor. Does that mean anything to you people who know about Egypt? What kind of a god was Hathor? What animal did she look like? A cow. So guess what? The Egyptian god of the Sinai is a cow. What did they put into the fire and what came out? A golden cow. Because they're saying, this is the god Hathor. She knows the way out of here. We'll follow her. Right? So there's a fascinating connection there with that. But probably Mount Sinai, I lean toward the traditional Mount Sinai that we find down at St. Catherine's Monastery and Jebel Musa, and that whole complex there. It's granite mountains. The top 2/3 of the Sinai is sand. The water just goes right through. But when you get down to the bottom third, we have granite. And I've actually eaten wild figs in August up in the top of the Sinai. I've drank from the wells up there. Don't recommend it, but I have done that a few times. And eaten food. You can grow gardens up there. And so it's the water gets trapped, the little bit of water that falls in the granite, right? And so they can go down and do wells, whereas in the others, just sand and just kind of disappears and goes down very, very deep. So I lean toward the traditional location of Mount Sinai. As a matter of fact, we'll be going there in a couple of weeks. I think about 4 weeks from today, we'll be climbing it. We'll do a morning climb to be there for sunrise. And so that's kind of that location. I'll probably, since you haven't asked any more questions, I won't get myself in any more trouble. I'll invite Pastor Paul to come up and talk about what's going on here and introduce things tonight.
Well, good evening. We welcome you once again. How many are here for the first time? Anybody? There are a few. The grapevine's been at work. That's a good thing in this case. We're glad that you're here, and we look forward to this evening. A lot to learn, isn't there? Travel is a wonderful thing. History we can learn from. I've been privileged to be in some of these areas a couple times, back in '98 and back in 2016. And the Scripture's never the same after you have been to some of these places and seen them and walked and listened and absorbed the cultures. I appreciate Tony Moore. I've spoken with him another number of times at various conferences we've been to, and we're privileged to have him here with us. So I'm glad that you're here. I understand there's a drawing tonight. Have you heard that? And we encourage you to pick up a hard copy of the lecture each evening in exchange for your card with your contact information. You receive the hard copy, but you also get a chance at receiving an antiquity of your very own. Now, which lamp are we giving away today?
Like this, and let me just say that I appreciate your church inviting me to come here, and this McDonald Road Church hosting this conference and inviting people to come. So I bought a number of lamps. This is wrapped up. I haven't looked at it, but my antiquities dealer assures me that this is a Roman era lamp from the 1st to 3rd century. So I have a batch of them, and I have just reached into the batch and pulled this one out that's wrapped in nice bubble wrap as it came from Jerusalem in April. and has actually, these came after that. They were shipped over to me after that. That's why it's got these funky little styrofoam things to mess up our carpet in here. So this is a Roman era lamp, and 1st to 3rd century AD, authentic, and hopefully beautiful.
All right. I need some help. I need someone that's willing to reach in this pile. You know, there were over 500 here last night. Two sessions, of course. Your cards that you have now will be used in a future drawing, okay? These are folks who came last night at 7, and I wonder if you would help me, please. Isabella? All right. This is a pretty tall stack here. We're mixing them up as best we can. You want to help me?
Now, Pastor Paul, I did this series in Bristol, Virginia, not long ago.
Yes.
And would you believe there was a young man on the front row at the public library there, and there's a young man up there, and he came up, and you know what happened? He drew his own card. Now, I thought it was a little funny, but if she draws her card, I mean...
Yeah, well, we
she'll
probably
be,
would have to disqualify her.
No, she'll be pretty good if she can draw her own card. Yeah.
All right.
Unless there's bubble gum on it or something like that, I don't know.
All right, you found one. Will you help me read it?
Chuck Robertson.
Chuck Robertson. Are you here, Chuck? Must be present to win. He was here at 4:30, I think. All right, let's try it again.
4:30 was complaining that we weren't mixing all the 4:30 and the 7, so maybe we'll mix them all together after this. But,
Yeah. All right. Gail Tyroff. Is Gail here? All right. She must have been at 4 o'clock as well, 4:30. Let's try again.
she's going to work down to her
You'd think
own
it'd
card,
be
I
easier
think.
than this, wouldn't you?
Dale Smith.
Dale Smith? I'm Paul Smith. Is that close enough? All right. Shake him up again. That's an interesting last name, isn't it? Brian Breetsky? Brian. All right. Good for you.
Wow.
Congratulations.
Process of elimination.
Thank you, Isabella. Appreciate your help. All right. Well, it's going to be a fascinating evening. Our title this evening is a kind of a tongue twister, isn't it? Fabulous Tales That Tell Tales. I'm interested in this, and I know that you'll find it very insightful as well. We also have, in the next few nights, In the Footsteps of Jesus, and I want to encourage you to participate and to take in as much as you can while Tony's here. Now, we don't meet tomorrow night, you remember? Monday night will be our next night together, so thank you for keeping that in mind. Let me offer a prayer as we get started. We thank you, Lord, for your word. We thank you for the biblical record. We're also thankful for the record that we find as we unearth, as we do archaeological study. We're thankful that as we do this study, as we pry into history, as we look at the evidence, that it does confirm the accuracy of your word to us. So we thank you for that. We are not here groping through earth blindly, but we have a light, we have instruction, we have guidance. May our confidence in the word be strengthened tonight as we look into the tales that the earth tells. We pray your blessing on Tony and on our time together, and we ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Pastor Paul, I want to ask a question. I heard there are snacks afterward. Is that what goes on here?
That's true. I did sample some of those last night, and there are a goodly number left.
Where do they find them?
They're in the atrium as we leave. That's
Oh, is
right.
that right? Wow.
So
I don't leave. I stay here to protect my things. So,
we'll bring you some.
but I want them to all know that there's some snacks afterward if you were liking such things. And good, my clicker's up here. So I just wanted to emphasize what Pastor Paul talked about. We still have some of the brochures if you'd like to invite someone to come. On Monday night, the Jew, the Arab, and Jerusalem. We should really say the Jew, the Christian, the Muslim, and Jerusalem. Jerusalem has a very long history. The Israelis celebrate 3,000 years just recently. We really got over a 4,000-year history. So we'll be looking at the long history of Jerusalem. It's a conflicted city, but it's one of my favorite cities. We'll be going there on Monday evening, and we'll have identical sessions, similar sessions on Monday. And then on Tuesday, we're putting in a new program that we're calling Christmas Eve in the Holy Land. And what goes on with that, I'm working on a new series we've been pitching to the History Channel called The Mysteries of the Fifth Gospel, and the opening episode is Christmas Eve in the Holy Land. We'll kind of look at the setting of the world into which Jesus was born. And so we'll be sharing that with you on Tuesday evening. Then on Thursday evening, we'll complete that and do Tracing the Footsteps of Jesus. And then next Friday night, we start this series. Be sure and pick up on the brochures as you go out. Tells you about Tracing the Footsteps of Jesus. I worked on this series. I had 7 one-month film trips in Israel and the West Bank working on this series over a 4-year period. And we'll be bringing together a beautiful video. There's lovely study guides, and it's something I think you will treasure and enjoy. Also, let me just say here on the table, we have some new things out tonight. We have this beauty here. I just bought a collection of Canaanite pottery. This is, okay, I'm going to hold it, I'll point it down. What's better? Okay, oh, good. I don't see it on the back screen, see. So here we have a beautiful Canaanite jar. It'd be kind of nice to have your chilled milk in, perhaps, from your Sub-Zero refrigerator. And then we have some nice cups that go with it. This is early Bronze Age. This is going to be the time of Jacob in the land, time of Moses, Joshua in the land. This is Middle Bronze Age, I should say. So around 1800 to maybe 1400 BC. I bought a whole collection of these. There were 3 of these nice jugs and about 6 or 8 of these cups. I didn't bring them all, but I thought that you might like to see these. And very, very beautiful with numbers from the Israel Museum on that. Some of you asked me, how do you know? And they actually, in Israel, it's a legal trade if it was found before 1967. Now, I think these were just found, but it was theoretically found in 1967, I suppose. I don't know how they do that. And then over here we have something, if you haven't seen it, we talked about Roman glass last night and the tear bottle. I'm assuming, there we go. And then next to that is a beautiful alabaster jar. And so this is paper thin. And they put the alabaster stone into it to allow them to do a very thin pressing of the glass or blowing of the glass. And you might remember that there's a tear jar that Mary is filling her tears up and pouring them on Jesus' feet. And then she breaks an alabaster jar. I used to think she shattered the jar. Now I realize she just broke the seal so she could pour the nard out, right? Broken and spilled out. Some of you heard those songs and things like that. So these things are on the table, and each evening we'll try and add some new items up here for you to be able to look at and enjoy. So we're going to now go back to our screen if we can, and we have fabulous tales to tell tales. Now the tell is the archaeological mound, the ruin. So it's stories that the archaeological ruins tell us. This is a very interesting place. It's not a New Testament site. It's Philippi, to where Paul wrote a letter called Philippians, okay? It's a Roman colony actually in northern Greece or in Macedonia, and you can see it was a storehouse area. These big pots were used for probably storing grain and various things that they'd have inside of this storehouse area from the place Philippi. But this evening we're going to look at various stories, and we're going to start by this wonderful story of Petra and its discovery. So some of you asked me about, do we do teaching tours? We don't do regular tours, we do teaching tours. And so we have a teaching tour, Egypt in the Bible. There was a couple here that are going on that at the earlier meeting this afternoon. And this coming up right upon us. We'll leave from here actually and go to Egypt for Egypt in the Bible. And then we do our teaching tours in Israel and Jordan in the spring because I like it when it's nicer and cooler and greener and the flowers are blooming. And some of the folks here have been on that tour. And it's a wonderful time to go. And people come back and they see their picture and say, where was that? And it was all brown when I went there. And so Israel is much like California, Southern California. Brown in the summer, green in the winter, and the green in the spring. So anyway, you can find out about that on our website, or if you have any questions, you can ask us. So Fabulous Tales the Tell Tales. Dean Burgeon's prize poem of 1840 kind of captured the essence of this city. Petra, the rose-red city, half as old as time. From the first time I heard about this city that had been discovered in southwestern Jordan, I had a deep desire to visit the ruins purported to be the most beautiful on the earth. And so in 1986, we took off and we went to this beautiful place. And now I got two different pictures. I got to pause because there's something different on that screen than on this screen. I don't know what's going on. We have to just have a little time. Otherwise, I'm going to have to follow. Okay? So I don't know. Thank you. So anyway, we can kind of see all these ruins, and we hear about this and say, wow, I wanted to see this. What is this really like? And so made my first journey to this place, and we'll kind of roll with it for a little bit and see what happens here. You can see all the beautiful ruins of Petra, and here we see this big rock. It's called Mount Seir, and anciently it was called Selah, which is a Semitic word meaning rock. Later on, it received the Greek name Petra, which also means rock. And so here is this fabulous place hidden away, and yet it was lost to the West for over 1,000 years. Westerners didn't know if it really existed or didn't, if it was just a legendary city. And so we want to find out about that. Well, my first trip over was in 1986. We took the Desert Highway. The Desert Highway connects Aqaba to Damascus. And you can see these cars, they're loaded and they're bound for Kuwait. They're coming up from Aqaba on the Desert Highway, loaded. Sometimes you see more interesting cargo as you're traveling along. We shot that just, a few miles, no. So anyway, very interesting area. And nowadays I travel the King's Highway when I can. The King's Highway is actually a biblical highway mentioned in Numbers chapter 20, verse 17. A couple of places, the King's Way. And so not many, pretty cool to have a highway mentioned in the Bible. So it's actually called the King's Highway because it was maintained by the kings on the Jordanian side. And so we think about an acronym GAME. There's 4 kings going from north to south. Gilead, the king of Gilead, the king of Ammon, the king of Moab, the king of Edom. So we have that, and so they maintained this that connected the port of Aqaba so they could go all the way up to Damascus on to Persia. So this was a second principal route in this part of the world. The primary route was the way of Horus, or the way of the Philistines, later called the way of the sea, and during Roman times called the Via Maris. Okay, that was Interstate 95. But this is kind of like Interstate 75, pretty important. And as it comes down, look at this. This is called the Arnon Valley. Now, the Arnon is mentioned in the Bible because the children of Israel, they have to go around Moab and Edom, Moab and Ammon, and they come here, and this is traditionally the northern boundary of the king of Ammon, and they come here and they go around the edge of the Arnon, and they encounter the king of Heshbon. And so this is the Grand Canyon of Jordan, and you can just imagine, you can see the road coming all the way down, it goes down several thousand feet, and then it comes up several thousand feet on the other side. Spectacular to go and visit, and since it's mentioned in the Bible, pretty impressive for me. By the way, from Aqaba to Amman, it's about, from Aqaba to, okay, let's put it this way. If you drive from Amman to Petra on the Desert Highway, it's about 3 hours. If you drive on that road, it's about 10 or 11 hours, okay? So not very many people do it, but that's what I do because I like it. It's a Bible road. So anyway, the children of Israel, they had to go around all of these areas because the Edomites wouldn't let them through, and the Moabites wouldn't let them through, and just discovered, by the way, there's a wonderful thing. I just started going there. We filmed it last fall, and now we've actually included in our tours. We go to the Brook Zered. Does that mean anything to you? Brook Zered, it says the children of Israel, they came up to the Brook Zered, and they went up the Brook Zered and around out into the desert to go around Moab and Edom. Pretty cool. Pretty cool. So they got to go around, but this rock here in Petra, they say it's the spring of Moses, so many people go there and stop. When we went in 1986, there were not many opportunities for staying or for housing, and so we went to this place, and so the guy had a little hotel next to that, and he insisted we check out the accommodations. There weren't many hotels in those days, so we went in, and my wife checked out the bathroom. Bathroom was a Turkish toilet. Have you used a Turkish toilet, some of you? You know, if you haven't, you know, it's just kind of usually a piece of porcelain with 2 steps and a hole in the middle. And in this particular hotel, the shower was right above that. So Helen said, Tony, you know, I can do a lot of things, I can't do this. So we went over to the government rest house. The government rest house was interesting because they actually had rooms in many of the caves of Petra. And so today, we actually use that. It's inside the site, past the museum, and we use that as our place. Now, my wife and I were up before sunrise, and we could see off in the distance this mountain. Can you see that beautiful mountain? That's the tallest mountain around. It's called Mount Hor. And can you see the little white dome building? We're zooming in on it. The little white dome building is the traditional location of Aaron's tomb. Remember, Aaron dies there in the 39th, 40th year of their journey, and he's buried, and this is the traditional place, so the Muslims have this little shrine here on top of Mount Hor. Now, Mount Hor is the tallest peak around. It's 3,500 feet above the surrounding area, but on the other side, it's even further down because you go down to the Wadi Araba. By the way, when you drive down the Wadi Araba, you can look up, and you can see that on the other side. So we're looking from the Petra side. Should have put one view in from the other side because it's just a little ridge of mountain running. And so very impressive. So we were up before sunrise, and we go out, and we just can't wait to see these ruins. Off in the distance, we could see this other big rock dominating the area. It's called El Birai, or the Mother of Cisterns. On top of it, there's hundreds and hundreds of cisterns carved into the rock, and it's called Mount Seir because this is where the Edomites lived. Do you remember who the Edomites are? The Edomites are the descendants of Esau, the brother of Jacob. And so that's why the children of Israel wanted to go through their land, but they said, no, you can't go through our land, and they had to go around the land and around Moab and Edom, who we will look at their lineage on Monday night. And so Mount Seir dominates the area, and there's an interesting prophecy there in Jeremiah 49, verse 16 about Mount Seir. It says, you who live in the clefts of the rocks, who occupy the heights of the hill, though you build your nest as high as the eagles, from there I will bring you down, declares the Lord. And so the Edomites are living up on top of that mountain. They've got all their water and these cisterns. They've got food up there. They learned a long time ago it's easier to throw rocks down than it is to throw rocks up. They should live forever. But they get replaced. They are no more. They pass away, and they're replaced by the Nabateans, descendants of the Ishmaelites who follow them. And so it's very interesting, very impressive to see the ruins of this. I have to tell you a funny story. My cameraman, we often lodge at Petra because there's not a lot of hotel options as we're filming. And we'll go back to the one slide if you can for me, since I'm telling a story that I wasn't anticipating telling. So we're lodging there, and my cameraman, $75 to get into Petra. And he says, okay, I'm not going to charge you the $75, but I want to run in. I know we got to leave at 8 o'clock, but I'll be back by 8 o'clock. It opens at 6. So he ran in, and he tried to get up to the high place. Instead of getting up to the high place, he got lost, and he climbed up to the top of Mount Seir. So I got some nice pictures of Mount Seir now. I need to put them into the story. But anyway, it's special to be here at Petra. So you can see all of these different tombs, temples as we go through. And my wife and I were out early. Let's see what we have now next there we go. So instead of going back in and getting the horses like a lot of people do in those days and coming down, I talked my wife instead to climbing down these sheer cliffs down into the site because I was excited to get in. I wasn't trying to avoid paying the entrance fee, but that's what we did. And coming down, we deposited lots of blood and skin on the mountains, but it only added to the anticipation of seeing the ruins purported to be the most beautiful upon the earth. And so we look at this cleft in the rock, It's impressive. Let's go back one up. For some reason that video didn't play. I'm sorry, but we've got a few. Yeah? There we go. We changed some of these things, but I don't know why. Anyway, it's not playing for us. So anyway, we see. Oh, it's playing? Oh, okay. It's not playing on my screen. All right. I'll watch this screen instead. So you can see the light of the sun is blocked out as it comes down. And so you wind through for just over 1.5 miles down this narrow, narrow canyon that's been carved through the sandstone mountains by the rain. Doesn't get a lot of rain there, but when it does, they can come as a flash flood and a real torrent. And so here you can kind of see it coming down. And as you wander down this 1.5 mile canyon, is called the Seek or the Cleft. It's just very, very impressive. And so there's only a couple of ways to get into Petra. Now here you can kind of see along the edge. When I first went here, the debris was way up here, so we didn't even see this. And then now we can see these canals or aqueducts on each side because they captured every drop of water and brought it into Petra. It was the Las Vegas of the ancient world. Okay? They're capturing that water and they're living in a powerful way. And so it's impressive to walk down through this. You know, you're twisting and turning, and you know, it goes around 1.5 miles as you're going down through here, and you're just excited about the anticipation of what's going to happen next. And so as we come in next, we can kind of see this. Here's the valley of Petra, and mostly surrounded by mountains, and only a couple of little areas where you can go in through these long, narrow gorges or clefts in the rock. And so you can see that a few hundred soldiers could keep thousands of soldiers at bay, because all they got to do is throw those rocks down on you with your armies coming, and you're done. And as we said earlier, it's harder to throw rocks up than it is to throw them down. And so these people had a very, very secure fortress here for a great period of time. Well, there's nothing that compares with this. As you come right to the end, it opens. Look at that. You know, you come to the end of the rocks, and here it opens into this beautiful monument. It's called El Kesna, the Treasury. And this is what Dean Burgeon had written about, and it's captured our imagination, captured the imagination even of Indiana Jones, didn't it? We'll talk about that in just a moment. And so here we see this beautiful treasure carved out of the living rock. We can see the Corinthian columns. We can see the doorway. Really, really fantastic. And so this is it's secluded from the wind and weather. It's kind of cut in, recessed into the rock, and it's a bit harder. And so this rock has survived down through time, where other places have been a bit more soft rock and more water and so on. Now, when I first went here, we were able to go into this room. And you might remember in the Indiana Jones movie, they go into the room and they find all kinds of things. If you saw the movie, I won't ask if you did, but if you did, I saw it. You know, Indiana, they find the Holy Grail in there, and there's all kinds of stuff and so on. Just a closet, nothing there. But if you go there today, you can't go in there. So when Jean and Kirby and Elaine, who are here, were with me, they couldn't go into that. We could only go and look, go up to the edge, because they discovered when they started clearing down at the bottom, they discovered that there were tombs there for King Aratus, the king who locked Paul in Damascus and closed the city gates. Very interesting, yeah. And so this beautiful building, and we can see it's suffered badly here. They've been taking pot shots at this. The idea developed that this was a treasury and that was full of gold, and so countless people would shoot their rifles at that. And of course, all they did was deface the monument. You can see the Corinthian columns. It's just really a splendid facility. It's called Kesna al-Faroun, or Pharaoh's treasury. It's not really a treasury at all. Now we know it's the tomb. And so it's a monument for the tomb of King Aratus, the king of Petra. He controlled the trade routes that went from Aqaba all the way up to Damascus. He was the king of Damascus as well, okay? So a very important king. And so here we can see this room. We used to be able to walk right into this and look around and just see that room and how plain it was. But today, they've actually, and here you can kind of see it, they have excavated down. And when you see pictures, when this was first discovered, the dirt is way up here. It's a little tiny doorway, because you can just imagine all the debris from the flash floods that have washed down into there, and the whole level has gone up 20, 30, 40 feet. As a matter of fact, this is all debris as well. And so if you look down into this, it's hard to get a picture. You can actually see these beautiful facades, much like this monument here for King Aratus and his family. Well, we look back at the Sikh, there's that little tiny cliff just 9 feet wide, and we have to wave bye-bye to that because we want to go in and see some of the other ruins. As we go through the valley, we see that there are literally thousands of tombs and houses and various things. Most of these are actually tombs carved in. Some are really worn away. Some are actually quite preserved. Depends on the type of rock they were. Here you can kind of see a lot of the debris that is piled up here and so on. And this this looks like the treasury building that we saw at El Kesna. Look at that. It's just, it's out exposed, and the rock is not very hard, and so it's just kind of washed away, barely recognizable. Now, when you go up the monastery, there's 1,000 steps, and those who are intrepid will go up the 1,000 steps, and you get up to the top. And here, this building at Deir was not carved in the mountain. It was carved by removing the mountain and revealing it. It has this beautiful urn up on the top, and it's quite impressive to go up. You can take the donkey up, the four-legged donkey, four-leg drive, I call it. But it's 1,000 steps up, and it's 1,000 steps down, and so it's interesting to see them on the donkey going down. I'm fortunate enough to be able to walk up and down, but very impressive. Look at that. Look at this huge doorway, over 30 feet high, as if cut for a race of giants. And so a fabulous building. In the old days, we could actually come up and hike up to the top of this, climb up to the top, and so the brave or the foolish, whatever you want to call us, could go up there, and you could actually see all the way across to the Arabah and to Israel on the other side. And so quite impressive to be there and explore. Well, the whole area has these minerals, and you can just see the various veins of colors of red and blue, and so it just makes the stone stand out. Look at these beautiful fairyland of blue and red and all these different colors from the minerals that have been deposited throughout time. And so a very impressive place to go. The Romans take the area. They don't really fight with the people from Petra. They make a deal, and so some of these kings will say, well, don't do it until I die, and then you can come in and have the land. That way it doesn't get all destroyed, and there's a peaceful transition. So the Romans take over the place. They build this beautiful amphitheater, seats about 2,500 people, fabulous acoustics. Next to the amphitheater is the way up to the high place. And the high place is quite impressive. It's a beautiful hike to go up to. But this was the ancient Acropolis of Petra. This is where they would go up and do their religious ceremonies, you might say. It was a place of worship. They have their altars up here. You can see this person's walking ahead of me. And so it's a very impressive place. Here we can see the high place. Here's the altar, where certainly animals were sacrificed, and perhaps humans as well. And the blood would then drain down and then down into the vat down here. They actually have a whole sanctuary area that is there, and the place of worship you can kind of see over here on the side, and very impressive for the ancients. Perhaps they began to sacrifice humans. We believe that to be true, or I believe that to be true, but it's not conclusive. Here we can see more of the Roman city. This again was the Las Vegas of the ancient world. They took all this water, they captured all the water, these dams. You can imagine how the flash floods would come through. They diverted that, they captured it, they put it in their aqueducts, brought it down. They had swimming pools and all of that, so really like Las Vegas. And yet all of this was lost to the West. We didn't know if it existed or not. We didn't know if it was just like Atlantis, a legendary city, until this guy, a Swiss explorer named John Louis Burckhardt. Around 1834, he's exploring the Middle East on behalf of a learned British society. He learns Arabic. He dresses as an Arab. He's traveling from Damascus down to Cairo, a very hazardous undertaking in the 19th century. And as he's going along the way, he begins to hear tales from various people about some extraordinary ruins at Wadi Musa. And he begins to wonder, could this be? Could it be Petra? Now, no Westerner has seen this for over 1,000 years. They don't know if it exists or not. And so as he's going along, he writes this in his diary. It's thrilling. The road from Shobak to Aqaba. Shobak, by the way, is one of the Crusader castles along the way. The road from Shobak to Aqaba, which is tolerably good, lies to the east of Wadi Musa, and to have quitted it out of mere curiosity to see the wadi would have looked suspicious in the eyes of the Arabs. I therefore pretended to have made a vow to have slaughtered a goat in honor of Aaron, whose tomb I knew was situated at the extremity of the valley. And by this strategy, I thought that I should have the means of seeing the valley on my way to the tomb. To this my guide had nothing to oppose. The dread of drawing on himself by resistance the wrath of Aaron completely silenced him. Get the idea? Wow, isn't that thrilling? So he's going, he hears this, he says, I got to check this out. So as he's going along, he finds a guide in Elgi, the little village there, and gets his goat. They head out. As they're going along, they begin to see. First Westerner in over 1,000 years to see this building. Can you imagine that? Well, he's taken back. He goes over and he sketches it. And he goes by and sees the Roman temple, the Corinthian tomb. He sees all these. He's sketching, and the guy says, "You're a treasure hunter." Pulls up his rifle, and he says, "Oh, no." So they go on to sunset. They sacrifice the goat to Aaron, and then they leave the valley. And this is what he writes. He says, it appears very probable that the ruins in Wadi Musa are those of ancient Petra, and it is remarkable that Eusebius is a 4th century historian, that Eusebius says that the tomb of Aaron was shown near Petra. And so it was true. Well, he leaves and he reports this, and people really can't go there, and it's still pretty dangerous to get there, and it was amazing. So we asked the legitimate question, how did this happen? How did it disappear? Well, let's look on this map. Here's Petra. And so here we see the King's Highway we just talked about. That's the road he was talking about from Aqaba to Shobak, going by Kerak, and there it's going to drop down into the Wadi, the Zered here, and here's the Wadi Arnon here we talked about. It's coming down. So this is Aqaba here, and so the trade route is going to go from Aqaba up to Damascus. But notice this, there's another route called the Spice Route, and it goes over to Gaza. So this route would come from Yemen and would cross, and so you could actually ship from here to here, and then you could put your stuff and send it out in the Mediterranean. So Petra was guarding the crossroads of these two very ancient highways. And they at first began raiding caravans passing through. But then they got a better idea. Why should we raid them? Why don't we protect them for a fee? Why don't we service them? Any idea of how many camels in a caravan at that time? 100? Any other ideas? 1,000. 1,000 camels in a caravan. And sometimes they would have 5 to 10 caravans in a train. So imagine rolling in with 10,000 camels to be watered and fed and taken care of, right? That's why they made an incredible amount of money from servicing the caravans. Now, the camels didn't come down that little road we were talking about. They had service areas out in the other area. This is where the people came, and the camel masters and the caravan masters and so on, they came in and paid tribute to the various gods and did their thing and enjoyed a night in Las Vegas, I guess, and so on. And the people who were actually doing the work, they were out there with all the other camels. So here they made all their money by protecting caravans, by servicing caravans, 10,000 camels. And here's some of the things they were doing. Look, that's frankincense. This stuff is multiple times the price of gold. It's coming out of Yemen, and they got to bring it up. They bring it up the Gulf of Aqaba, then they put it on camels. And so this is the ancient trading routes. And so the frankincense and the myrrh and the nard all coming down from that part of the world, and much more precious than gold as it's being sent out up to Damascus, Persia, off into Europe, and so on. But once the sea lanes opened up so they could go from here around Africa to Europe, there was no longer any need to go this way, and guess what happens? The whole place is forgotten and deserted so that we don't know if it ever existed or not. The West totally forgets about it, and we're not sure what will happen. And so we read this text from the Bible, from Obadiah. This is what the sovereign Lord says about Edom. Remember, we said the children of Esau lived here. The pride of your heart has deceived you, you who live in the clefts of the rocks and make your home on the heights, you who say to yourself, who can bring me down to the ground? So they're very secure. Though you soar like the eagle and make your nest among the stars, from there I will bring you down, declares the Lord. There will be no survivors from the house of Esau. The Lord has spoken. On Tuesday night, we're going to talk about one of the last survivors of the house of Esau. He's somebody you've heard about, but you may not know his ethnicity. His name is King Herod the Great. His father is an Edomite. His mother's a Nabatean princess. He's not Jewish. But we'll tell that story on Tuesday night. Fascinating story. So anyway, we can see that these tremendous verses of the Bible fulfilled in what's happened in Petra. We can actually see the archaeologists have come in. Now, Petra doesn't have a great thing for biblical archaeology except the stories we've told about, and now King Aretas. But the spate of the archaeologist affirms the Bible over and over. So I want to explore some of that with you this evening as we look at fabulous tales to tell tales. Now, here we see the city of Jerusalem. We're looking from the Mount of Olives across the Kidron Valley, and people during the one period of time, the Byzantine church, they were going to Jerusalem, and during the Crusades, because they thought they could get salvation from going there, right? Fascinating film, The Kingdom of Heaven, kind of portrays that a little bit about how you go to Jerusalem and absolve your sins, and people were going there for that reason. But then during the Renaissance, the Reformation, people were saying, you don't get salvation from that, you get salvation from believing in Jesus. And so they didn't go, but they began singing about the Jordan River and the Sea of Galilee, and they began wondering, what were these places like? And so pretty soon travelers start going, and they come back and they begin writing about the Jordan River or the Sea of Galilee we have on the screen right now. And they began bringing back a cursory understanding of the Bible lands so they could understand their Bibles a little bit more. Well, that made sense. During the Renaissance, people were going to collect treasures, and so they were actual treasure hunters. They were just looking for that. They weren't trying to do any extensive excavations and so on. They were just looking for things to sell in the museums. And then when Napoleon went down into Egypt, as we talked about last night, they discovered the Rosetta Stone. Boy, all of a sudden the whole thing opens up as people can understand, and they can write and understand, they can understand what was written about the ancient Egyptian culture, and there's just a fascination with this part of the world. In 1850, there's a man who will become a famous archaeologist named Edward Robinson. He's standing here by the spring of Jericho. Jericho is considered to be the oldest town in the world by most authorities. And he's standing here at the spring, and he's saying, I'm here at the spring of Elisha, but I have no idea where Jericho is. He doesn't realize it's less than from here to the back wall of the church, from where he's standing, because it is underneath this mound. He doesn't understand that the old city is under the mound. And so these cities collapsed. As they collapsed, the dirt blew in. The wind blows in plants. The seeds start growing. Pretty soon it's just a hill. And they didn't know until they started excavating. And so this is actually Tel Jericho. Now, when you go to Tel Jericho, it's rather shocking. 6 acres in size. If you take everything you could possibly take of the lower city, 10 acres in size. No more than 1,000 people living there. Very small. Most of these cities are very, very small cities. Problem is we often project from our world into that world. But it had very massive walls. That's a whole different story. Actually, you can actually see part of the cyclopedic wall here. Jericho's not our subject, but they have a 25-foot high cyclopedic wall with these huge stones. And then on top of that, they had a 15 to 20-foot high mud brick wall. And so very interesting about Jericho, but that's not our subject. And then they go up and they in 1880 or so, they find some of these tombs around Jerusalem. They go in, and we looked at this last night, in these ossuaries, and they find all kind of pottery and different things in there, but they're just kind of ransacking it because they really don't know. They're not really excavating it to speak of. And then Sir William Flinders Petrie goes down. He wants to measure the pyramids. There was a whole period of time when people thought this pyramid and the size of it must be a prophecy about the future of the world. And so he goes down for that purpose. And as he's there, he's amazed at what he's discovering about the Bible. And so he kind of is amazed. And so he passes on some of this knowledge to a guy named Pierre Vincent, who becomes a specialist in pottery typology. Now, for a lot of time, they could take this pottery that's found from Cyprus and Crete, and they could date it, the painted pottery, because it kind of evolves through time. And they began to wonder, as they're finding all this pottery in Palestine, could we figure out Could we correlate this with different events? And so Pierre Vincent became a specialist in pottery typology as he started studying and trying to see how pottery evolved. Now, I don't know, should we try that? Camera down here? Okay. Now, on the table, I know a lot of you don't get to come and look at this, so I want to just show you what we have here on the table, and we can see how these lamps have evolved. We have lamps from over here from the time of Abraham. And so I'm pointing here now, these lamps are from 2000 BC, 4,000 years old. Now we come down, we're time of Moses, 1500 BC. Now, if you look at this lamp, look how it's rolling around. Would you like that kind of a thing? Look at that. Not very good. You look at this one, and if we turn it over, we can see it's kind of flat on the bottom. See, it's kind of flat on the bottom. So it's a bit more stable, kind of good. You get another 500 years to the time of the Iron Age, and look at what they've done. You see that? They've actually flattened it out. Now, you'd think they'd have thought about that in the very beginning, but they didn't. And then they've kind of done this little flare around the edge. Can you see the flare around the edge? So this pottery actually evolves over a period of time. We come down a little further, and they're trying to pinch this one here. See how they're trying to pinch it? This is in the Persian period. And then they get to the point where they're able to actually make things in a mold and put them together like this. And then these clearly evolve as well, and they become more stylized. Here's one with a 7-branched candlestick on it, a Jewish lamp. And then there's some that have crosses on them, the Christian lamps. And then we have some very typical Herodian lamps. So my point is that this whole pottery evolves, and they're able to look at that, and they find broken pieces of it in the places, and they say, that's from that period of time. And so this is the way that archaeology was working and what they began to establish. And so Pierre Vincent became a specialist of this. He went down to Tel El Hesi, down by the Mediterranean, and a wadi, like a flash floods, had cut right through this, and they were able to see bricks exposed, like to see the mud bricks there, mud bricks here, and then you can see all the fill in here, because things just kind of filled in through the centuries, and they could see all this pottery and debris. And so they began to be more systematic in how they excavated and went down, and they found all these broken pieces of pottery, and they were able to say, this is this kind of pottery, from this period of time, and they correlated that with Egyptian history and with Greeks period and so on. So this is an interesting quote from Biblical Archaeology in Focus. The humble potsherd, the rubbish on the ground of any excavated site, was elevated to become the major implement in the archaeologist's hand in his attempts to pry open the vault of time. And so the rubbish that we step on as we walk around on these things is what they actually used to be able to validate this. And if you look here carefully, you can see this is all pieces of pottery in there. You see that and all that fill? And so we actually, almost you can see strata, can't you? Different strata. And so these two principles that we call sequence dating of the pottery, how it evolves from age to age, and the stratigraphy of the site. That is, that people who lived here first lived down here, and then somebody else lived here, and then somebody else lived here, and so on. Those are the two main principles of how archaeology works. And so we go back to we want to dig down to the beginning, but you can't just dig down to find who lived there first, right? You've got to treat everything equally, and that's what they do, is they systematically go down into the earlier time periods here. And so we can see the pottery. Vinton, as I said, became the specialist in this, and he was able to work out a chronology. Here we can see some lamps working out a chronology as time passes by and how these things evolve. And so we get a fairly good understanding of the sequence of this. Now, this is some interesting pottery. These are broken pieces of pottery, and they call the broken pottery ostraca or ostracon, plural. And so here you can see these have writing on them. This happens to be from a place called Lachish. And here there's some writing about the signal fires from the next village have ceased. That means the Assyrians have captured that and they're coming after us next, so our number is just about being called. Now, when the Greeks had a trial, they would give the jurist a piece of pottery to write on, guilty or not guilty. If you voted guilty and the person was guilty, what would happen to the person? They would be ostracized. That's where our word comes from, right? And so we wonder, well, why do they just keep living in the same place over and over again? Why was a site chosen? You see what would happen if you're living in one spot and maybe a king came through and did war with everybody there and took all the women and the children off and killed the men. The children said, well, there was a place and they're going to go back there and live again. and they go back and straighten it out, and they build on top of it, and then maybe a plague comes through, and a lot of people die from that, and it kind of collapses and falls apart, and they build on it, and the debris, and it just keeps growing. But why go back to that? So what do you need? First thing you need is what? Water. So help me with some sources of water. We talked about one, the most important, the best one would be what? Jericho, a spring, right? Doesn't get any better than spring water. So that's one good source, and so that's why it's considered to be the oldest town in the world. But what's another source of water? What would you need? Sorry? Rain, so cisterns. You could have cisterns where the water could collect in the cisterns if you had non-porous rock, like at Mount Seir. Problem in Israel is most of the rock is porous, and so you couldn't really do that very well until they invent plastering, and it gets there around the 8th century BC. Now they can plaster in the time of King Hezekiah. They can expand the city and so on. Another source. Rivers, okay. Maybe by a river, and how many cities in America by rivers? You know, it's pretty impressive. The Nile, you know, we talked about that last night. Another source. Lakes, another source. Wells, okay, so Abram, we think about Abram and Jacob, Isaac, a lot of the springs have been claimed, but these guys have to dig their own water sources, wells. And so not a lot of sites have all this criteria. The next one is defensive walls. You want to have defensive walls because it's easier to throw rocks down than it is to throw rocks up, and so they build their cities on top of hills, right? And so you can have defensive walls. The third is arable soil. Look at this, here's interesting, there's a river coming by, so there's some water, here's some land to farm. Can you see the ruins here? Here's the gate coming in, you can see the ruins. You can almost see the wall, the perimeter of the wall going around this tell, can't you? And so very, very impressive, arable soil. And then things that you would worry about is the freeway, is the interstate going by, you know? Can you get down to Atlanta quickly? You know, we worry about where the trade routes are and things like that, who are the neighbors. But these, not a lot of sites have all of this criteria, so they tend to get recycled, passed on, generation after generation, and thus the hills go up, 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 up. So how can you tell if it's a hill or a tell? How do you distinguish between them? Well, the tells tend to be conical. They tend to get smaller at the top, like a cone going up. And then they have visible building remains, like we saw a moment ago, some of those stones, those dressed stones sticking up right out of the ground. And then they have ancient traditions. Often the name is preserved even in modern languages like Arabic in Palestine and Israel. Many of the names come right through. And then, of course, as you're walking around, you're walking on broken pieces of pottery. They just kind of have a way of working up to the surface. And so we see that we have that criteria, and that's why they're recycled. So here's an interesting quote from archaeology and the religion of Israel. There can be no doubt that archaeology has confirmed the substantial historicity of the Old Testament tradition. And so it's fascinating as we go back and look. Here's Nuzi. It's a place in Syria. They found these cuneiform tablets, and the tablets tell stories that are fascinating. One tablet tells a story about a wife who did not have any children, and how that their law said that she should choose a surrogate to have children for her, and that child would be hers and would be the heir unless later she had a child of her own, and then that child would be the heir. What does that sound like? Sarah and Abraham and Hagar, doesn't it? And so then we find this one about a birthright being sold for 3 sheep. What does that sound like? Jacob and Esau. And so these stories that seem so strange to our ears, and from our perspective, we find are actually the customs of the day from that perspective. And so we see that over and over, so many of these stories are being affirmed or confirmed by the Bible as archaeology has been digging in these different places. Well, in 1988, I went to this place. It's called Tel Mardik. It's Ebla. It's 150 acres in size. How big was Jericho at the biggest? 10 acres, 6 to 10 acres. So if we can take the biggest 10 acres, so it's 15 times the size of Jericho. Over 30,000 people living there, over 300,000 people that were in the environment. And our slides are rolling on past me anyway, so let's go back here. So in 1964, the Italians began to dig here at Tel Mardik, and they found a couple of things, not too much, very impressive, but as the years go on, they keep digging in this very big city, a city we didn't know even existed, and then they found the royal palaces. And so this is pretty exciting. They found this royal palace, And then they discovered 10 tablets in 1973, and then in 1976 they find 1,000 in the beginning of September. By the end of the month, they found 20,000 tablets, okay, of a society we didn't know it existed even. And so they find these, and here they find them in this room I'm standing in. I didn't have gray hair. And they find these in there. And what had happened, the Akkadian conquerors had come. They had burned the city. They baked all of these tablets into a stone-like hardness. They were on the shelves. They all collapsed down. And so when Professor Mathia, the archaeologist, looks in, he says, my first impression was that I was looking at a sea of tablets. As I said, 20,000 tablets found here. But they found thousands of dictionaries also to help them to understand this language. And they began working on this to try and understand who they were, what was going on. As I said, more than 30,000 people lived in the city, more than 300,000 people around it, a huge city. But they did trade. They weren't a military power, they were a trading power. And they found trade records with Hatzor. By the way, Hatzor is mentioned as a city that Joshua conquered when they came in. Lachish, we saw a picture of Lachish a moment ago. Megiddo, Gaza, we saw that on the screen earlier. And Salem. By the way, how is Jerusalem pronounced in the book of Genesis? Melchizedek is the priest king of Salem, right? And so here actually is what was being called at that time. Fascinating, isn't it? And then Professor Pettinato, now he was the linguist in charge of this. He shocked the world when he said they found bills of sale to Sodom and Gomorrah. What? There was no record of Sodom and Gomorrah anywhere. Professor Pettinato said bills of sale to Sodom and Gomorrah. Now I want to tell you, there's a little controversy about that today, but he also said they found names paralleling Abraham, Ishmael, Israel, Esau, and Eber, the king mentioned in the book of Genesis. And there's controversy about this today. And I know we're filming, so but I'm going to go ahead and say it. I'm not going to Syria anytime soon. I had a group of pastors on tour and around 1999. And I told our young tour guide, we want to go to Tel Mardik. He said, you don't want to go to Tel Mardik. I said, we want to go to Tel Mardik. Well, let's go over here. No, we want to go to Tel Mardik. Well, in those days, this was a totally communist country, socialist country, I should say, very socialist country. So as we're going along, he gets away from the bus driver. He says, you see that hill there? That's not really a hill. That's a secret prison in that hill. And he says, I can't say anything around this bus driver. I say, okay. So I get away from the bus. Tell me what's the story with Ebla. Why don't you want to go to Ebla? Because of this, the Syrians were fearful that Israel would use this as a basis for invading Syria and taking their land. And we say, what? Well, that's what they believe about the West Bank, you see. And so there became a huge controversy in Syria. So Professor Mathia was political, and he said, oh, nothing about Sodom and Gomorrah, nothing about Abraham, nothing about any of this. Professor Pettinato said, of course it is. Guess what? Professor Pettinato's credentials to work in Syria were withdrawn. Professor Mathia's credentials were renewed. So there's controversy. So for my money, I still believe it says this, just as Pettinato had said in the beginning. And so Albright became the father of biblical archaeology. He's considered that. He saw more and more data coming in confirming the Bible. He wrote this in 1936. Genesis 14 used to be considered as unhistorical. Now we're more modest. 19 years later, he rewrote this more positively to say Genesis 14 can no longer be considered as unhistorical in view of the many confirmations of details which we owe to recent finds. What would he have written if he saw the finds come in from Ebla? He goes on to say, the narratives of Genesis dealing with Abraham may now be integrated into the life and history of the time in such surprisingly consistent ways that there can be little doubt about their substantial historicity. Isn't that impressive? But what would have happened if he lived on to see all these other things that have come in, like at Ebla? In 1988, I went up into northern Turkey to this place, Boğazkale, because I wanted to follow the footsteps of a Frenchman named John Texier. Texier was exploring this area. He was looking for the Roman city Tavium, and he's looking for it, and he doesn't find Tavium. Instead, he finds this. Look at these rows, these huge walls, these big rows of stones, a city bigger than Athens at the height of its glory. Problem was, No such city missing. What city was it? They had no idea. He finds there these strange things guarding the gates, like sphinxes and gods. What is this? Here we see some warriors, gods. They don't know what it is. And then he finds these with these lions. What city could this be? Larger than Athens? No such city missing, and all the Greek and Roman literature have no idea what it is. And then the natives take him to this place, Yazilikaya, and it means inscribed rock, and they go out to what turns out to be the sanctuary area, the worship center, and they have all these worship areas, and then you get into this little tight place, and on both sides they have these inscribed gods, these gods carved into the wall on both sides. What could this be? And then they found writing, strange writing. It resembled hieroglyphs, but it was different. And then they found this writing all through this area, but not just here in northern Turkey. They found it all the way out to the Aegean Sea by Ephesus. They found it all the way down into Syria. What? This is not just a city, it's an empire, larger than modern Turkey. What could it be? Who could it be? Some conservative scholars began to advance the idea that it was the Hittites. But the others said, oh, it couldn't be. They never existed because the Greeks and Romans never wrote about them, so it can't be Hittites. They had their territory up here, all the way down into Syria, all the way over to the edge of the Aegean, all this area being ruled by the people doing this. So who were they? Well, the Bible talks about the Hittites over 48 times. So people should have taken advantage of that and said, must be the Bible. Once the Bible even mentions the king of the Hittites with the king of the Egyptians. Could it be? Then they discovered the Rosetta Stone. And now old Karnak began to unlock its secrets. And on the walls of Karnak, Ramses the Great talks over and over about his fights with the Hittites. Now, there was no fourth estate in that day. There was no independent journalism to verify what Ramses was saying. So he's always saying, I put them to fight, right? I took care of them. Everybody believed it for over 3,000 years. Matter of fact, let's see, I may have some things here and yet, when they go a little further, we'll come back to Ramses' story in just a moment. Let's go back if I can get back, I don't know. One more. I've got to go back the other way, I'm sorry. One more back, if you can go back. One more. There we go. So here we have a very important document that is discovered. It's the first international peace treaty in the history of the world. And guess who it's between? Ramses the Great and the king of the Hittites. And yet down in Karnak, we see that this propaganda that he's been putting out was believed for over 3,000 years. Matter of fact, this is what he said about himself. He called himself the fearless one. I'm the fearless one, right? He's got to be that way, you know. I'm the fearless one. I'm the one who put an end to the boastfulness of the king of Haiti, right? I put the wood to those guys. I did it. I took care of them. I put them to the sword. I'm the son of Ra who trampled the land of Haiti under my feet. Now we know it's all shameless propaganda, believed for over 3,000 years. What happened? Ramses the Great went up to confront the king of the Hittites. Here's a third great empire of the day. So we have the king of the Assyrians, we have the king of Egypt, and we have the king of the Hittites. And he goes up and confronts the king of the Hittites. King of the Hittites is a very smart guy. So he gets some Bedouin spies, and he sends them down and says, you go down and tell Ramses that I heard he was coming and he was so powerful, I took off and went back to my home country. And he laid a trap. And Ramses was susceptible to flattery, and what does he do? Steps right into the trap. They collapse on him. He barely escapes with his life, loses most of his armaments and most of his people. No wonder he's willing to fill out that peace treaty with the king of Haiti. Yet he goes back and he boasts about all this other. So here we see a great third empire of the day, just as the Bible talked about, even though there was no reference to them in the Greek or the Roman literature. And so what a powerful story. By the way, they pioneered the use of iron. They developed iron technology here, exported it to the Philistines who had the leg up on the Israelites because they couldn't deal with iron. So we see these cuneiform tablets that have been found and how that they affirm the Bible. We can see these clay cylinders, how they affirm the Bible, all these coming in time after time, affirming the biblical story that the Bible is true. And so I want to take you to one more place here. This is Babylon. And so they go to Babylon, and we find these beautiful glazed tiles. Some of you have probably seen these in the Pergamum Museum, or you've seen them in the Ankara Museum, or in the Istanbul Museum. These are actually winged lions from the Ishtar Gate of Babylon. Now, the book of Daniel is very interesting because it talks about a prophecy. Remember that prophecy? Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome, breakup of Rome. And so it's kind of predicting the world, the future of the world. So how do people who don't believe the Bible is inspired deal with that? They say, well, actually it was written during the Roman period. And it's just history written in prophetic form and poetic form. You know, they're writing as a prophecy that happened after it all happened. And that's what they say. Daniel lived down in the 2nd century BC. He's really just in the Roman period. It's a masquerading as prophecy. And that's all the deal. Because in Greek and Roman literature, they knew that Nabonidus was the king of Babylon when it fell. But, as these young people here can tell us, who was the king of Babylon when it fell? Belshazzar. But there was no record of a Belshazzar anywhere in the Greek or Roman literature, so they said it can't be just a Jewish myth. And then in 1861, Talbot does the prayer of Nabonidus, this cylinder, a prayer, and he says, I'm praying for my oldest son, Belshazzar. Well, right away, conservative scholars said, there it is. Even Talbot himself said, oh, that's not the Belshazzar of the Bible. It doesn't call him king. And then in 1882, the Nabonidus Chronicle is transcribed. During the capture of Babylon, Nabonidus is in Arabia. He's not even down in Babylon. He's gone down to Teman, Arabia. He's collecting butterflies and worshiping down there the moon god. And then Smith does the verse account of Nabonidus in 1924, in which he says he entrusted the kingship to his oldest son. Wow. And so we see these things affirm the story of Daniel, and so it puts liberal scholars in a very peculiar situation, as we see from R.H. Pfeiffer of Harvard University. He writes, how well are we, he says, we shall presumably never know how our author learned that Belshazzar, mentioned only in the Babylonian records and Daniel and in Baruch 1:1, which is based on Daniel, was functioning as king when Cyrus took Babylon. But we know he wasn't there, right? Because if he was there, what do we have to say about Daniel chapter 2 and the prophecies? They're real prophecies. So it couldn't be that he was really living there, but we'll never know how he could have this other information that nobody else had in the 2nd century BC. Kind of silly, isn't it? Much better just to say Daniel was living in that time and he writes a prophecy, and this book is true. The Bible again and again has been vindicated as historically accurate. Dougherty wrote this in his book Nabonidus and Belshazzar. Of all the non-Babylonian records dealing with the situation at the close of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, the 5th chapter of Daniel with Belshazzar ranks next to cuneiform literature in accuracy so far as outstanding events are concerned. Amazing, isn't it? Amazing. But some people say, well, man, how much has the Bible been changed? You know, long time separating from when it was written to today. Frederick Kenyon, professor down at Yale, wrote this in 1939. How well are we provided with manuscripts of the Hebrew Old Testament? It is generally rather a shock when one first learns that the oldest existent manuscripts are no earlier than the 9th century after Christ. Get that point? So what our Old Testament is based upon, he's saying in 1939, he writes that what our Old Testament is based upon is manuscripts from the 9th century after Jesus, over 1,000 years separating them from when they were actually written. He goes on to say, over 1,000 years separate our earliest Hebrew manuscripts from the date at which the latest of the books contained in them was originally written. It is a disquieting thought when one reflects how much a text may be corrupted or mutilated by the course of transmission by manuscript over a long period of time. He's saying, can you imagine how much they've been changed? For 1,000 years. Wow. When did he write that? 1939. Because what happened 8 years later? Muhammad Abdi was out looking for his lost goat, according to the story. Remember that? Looking for that lost goat. And we'll try and go back to that one slide for me. I don't know why I've got it skipping around. He's looking for that lost goat, and according to the story, he throws a rock up and into that cave. Now, how a goat gets up into that cave, I don't know. But anyway, according to the story, he throws a rock up there, and hears pottery breaking, and he said, wow, must be evil spirits, and he takes off running, and he gets to his tent, and according to the story, he thinks, is it evil spirits or is it a pot of gold? So the next day, he gets his courage up according to the story, and he gets his friend, and they go back, and they crawl in, and look what they find. They don't find gold. They just find a bunch of clay, pottery, and some old leather scrolls. And so, according to the story, Adib takes this back to his tent, and he stretches it from one side of the tent to the other, doesn't know what to do with it. And so if you had a crow that could fly there, it would fly the way the buzzard flies, we could say. It goes from the Qumran up to Bethlehem. It's only about 8 miles across the desert. He takes these scrolls up, and he's trying to sell them. And he goes to Kando, who's a general. He deals with antiquities and general store guy and a shoe cobbler. And he says, well, maybe I can use it for mending shoes. Don't know what to do with it. Now, that's a traditional story. I'm quite good friends with his grandson, and his grandson tells me a very different story. He says, you guys have cowboys. Are they children? We have shepherd boys like cowboys. They're not children. He says, my grandfather was employing people to look for antiquities. And he employed Muhammad Abdib and his group down looking for pottery and gold coins and various things we could sell to him, and he could then sell on the antiquities market. And that he created this story as a diversion after they found all of this stuff. He brings him to him, and the grandson tells this wonderful story to me. And whenever I bring groups, I arrange to have him share it with our groups, that one of the first scrolls that was brought to him, he was looking at it. He's an Aramaic Christian. And remember, part of Daniel is written in Aramaic. And he could see and read that part of Daniel and realized it was part of the Bible. And so over a period of time, this comes to light, and we discover that it's actually ancient copies of the Hebrew Scriptures. And so it's exciting. Now again, up here, it kind of makes sense. Why is your goat up here? It doesn't make any sense. But they go back and they begin to find this. And then, of course, they get involved once they realize this is going on, and the British say, we're going to give a shilling for every piece of it that is found. And guess what happens, guys? Local tour guide I use there is from Bethlehem, and an ordained Nazarene pastor, soccer, and he says, my dad was part of that group. And they cut the pieces up because you had a shilling for each piece. Wasn't very wise what the British did. But anyway, that's why there's just so many pieces and fragments and so on. So right away they begin to wonder, who are these people who are doing this? Who put these scrolls in the caves? So they long knew that there was a place called Khirbet Qumran. Here's the Dead Sea down here. They were down here. They were growing balsam and making medicine from balsam. They're growing dates and so on. And so these turn out to be the Essenes. They're like an ultra Orthodox group of Pharisees who reject the Sadducees and the way they run the temple, and they come down and live down here by the Dead Sea. And they live in this really harsh environment, and they're baptizing themselves. They use all their water for ritual baptisms a couple a day. They have to immerse themselves a couple of times a day to be pure. And so we find these all over the site, these baptismal pools. And they find workshops, and then they find this room. And they think at first it's a dining room, and then they discover it's not a dining room at all. It's a scriptorium. And they find that there's, on the tables, they found ink wells. And when they compared the ink and analyzed the ink in the ink wells with the ink on the scrolls, they found they matched. They found that the clay pottery matched. And all of a sudden they realized that this is a place where they were copying the Scriptures. And then when the Romans, after they conquer Jerusalem, they come down and they're marching down toward the last group of extremists, the zealots who are down at Masada. And these people hide the scrolls in the caves and run to Masada where they lose their lives. And there the scrolls stay in that. By the way, there's 4 jars they found in that cave. 2 are in the Israel Museum that you can't take pictures of. And one's in the Vatican and one's in my friend's shop in Bethlehem. So it's kind of nice to go there. And if you don't buy something, you can see that one of the original 4 jars, and you can actually take pictures of it. And so you're asking, why don't we have a picture of it up on the screen? I'll show you one on Monday night, if I can remember. So anyway, we see this incredible thing where they found the scrolls here. And so immediately we wonder, well, how does it compare? Well, they found the entire book of Isaiah. They found actually sections of every book of the Hebrew Scriptures with the exception of the book of Esther, because it doesn't mention the word God. And so Miller Burroughs is the secretary of the American School of Oriental Research, He announces the discovery to the world of the scrolls. He writes a book, and this is what he says in his book. Some readers may be disappointed that the translations of the Isaiah manuscript are not included in this edition of the text of the Dead Sea Scrolls. The fact is that most of the differences between these manuscripts and the traditional Hebrew text do not involve changes of meaning that would be evident in a translation, and the differences that do involve such changes are not sufficiently frequent to justify the space for the translations of these texts. So what did Kenyon ask? How much has it been mutilated over 1,000 years? How much has it been changed? Burroughs says not enough that you would know the difference in an English translation. Incredible. And so we can have confidence because there are fabulous tales that tell tales. So from Petra to Nuzi to Khorsabad, all through the ancient world, we're seeing the same story. From the Hittites down to the Dead Sea, we see over and over that the spade indeed confirms the book. It affirms the book, and the stories we see are true, that have been verified or proven or affirmed, I should say, would be the best word to use. I love this text from Isaiah 40, verse 8. The grass withereth, the flower fadeth, but the word of our God shall stand forever. And so God's preserved his word. And I want you to have confidence as we looked at these various things that can give us confidence in that. I love this poem by the Quaker poet, John Greenleaf Whittier. He says, we search the world for truth. We call the good, the pure, the beautiful. From graven stone and written scroll in all the old flower fields of the soul. And weary seeker of the best, we come back laden from our quest to find that all the sages said is in the book our mothers read. Let's pray together. Father in heaven, thank you tonight for this opportunity to drift away to faraway times and places, to investigate these fascinating wonders like at Petra and to see these evidences from archaeology that affirm the historicity of the Bible. We thank you for these stories. We thank you. I pray that you'll help each of us to have more confidence in your word as a result of this. And as we read your word, we pray, I just want to pray that we'll hear your voice speaking to us and guiding our lives and blessing us today here in the 21st century. We thank you that it's relevant and meaningful, and I pray a blessing upon each one who is here. In Jesus' name, amen. So I want to remind you that tomorrow night, we don't have a meeting, or tomorrow, but on Monday, the Arab in Jerusalem, and then that's at 4:30 and 7, and then we're going to do not Tracing the Footsteps. It's going to be Christmas Eve in the Holy Land. We'll look back at the kind of the world of the setting of Jesus' birth. And then on Thursday, Tracing the Footsteps of Jesus. And then on Friday, we'll start the new series. Be sure and pick up one of the brochures so you can have the details for that as you go out this evening. We look forward to seeing you on Monday at one of the two meetings. You're welcome to come up and enjoy the artifacts or ask questions and enjoy the refreshments as you go. Be sure and turn in your card, and we'll look forward to seeing you on Monday. Good night. May God bless you.